Okay, and that doesn't include anything that went well because, well.
Yeah. Okay, I've started recording and can edit in the video later.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Steering Election Retro. Not too many people here, but we will sort of give it a go. As a general reminder, we abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, which essentially boils down to please be excellent to each other. And this meeting is recorded and will be posted to the Kubernetes YouTube channel later today. If you do not have the link to the retro, I am pasting it in the chat here. And we will try and get through this fairly quickly. Let's go start off with what went well. Nikita?
Do we want to go over everything, or
do you just want to go over the highlighted items?
Let's start with the highlighted items.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So what could have gone better? Move nomination threads to GitHub.
Yeah, so this was brought up in the last retro, I think. And yeah, sorry, Josh, go ahead.
It was, and if you look at the fourth highlighted item there, it was, but it was not communicated to the new election officers until about 12 hours before the nomination period was due to start. Absolutely. This is how we should have done it. We were basically handed the previous retro document without any sort of handoff on it. Like nobody explained to us which things were important. And as a result, neither Jace nor I saw that particular item. And the documentation for how to run a steering committee election says mailing list. The documentation was not updated. And so less than a day out from the start of nominations, we made the judgment call to not change anything. If I had it to do again, I actually probably would have changed it anyway because the mailing list process was really, really annoying.
Yeah. Do you have a pointer to the documentation that you followed? I mean, I can see like the readmes and various things, but having a list of the docs we need to update in response to this retro would be super helpful.
Yeah. And not following up on updating some of those items was like, George's and my bad from last year. We didn't go through a whole bunch of the items that need to be updated and templated things out, but I think that one just fell through the cracks. As far as like the handoff goes, I thought there was a discussion of a meeting, but we mostly had it in Slack between the five of us.
Yeah, here we go. Well, actually, let me comment on the doc rather than pasting it to chat. Yep. No, better than a comment. Okay, let's move on to the next one while I type this out.
Nikita, do you want to read the next one? You jotted it down.
Sure. So there were some discussions on the exception criteria and how well that was clarified on social media. So I think we did lay out the exception criteria pretty well in the SurveyMonkey form that we used, but I think it would also be useful to lay that out in the voters guide as well going forward.
It was pretty clear. We got pretty clear feedback from a number of parties that they still felt They felt like asking for an exception was demanding something, like as in you had to have extraordinary reasons to not qualify for a vote under normal circumstances. A couple of people said that. I pinged them and I said, any suggestions on what we could say in the documentation that would be because the documentation board clearly says, hey, we realize that DevStats is not going to capture everybody. If you have any other reason, please put this. But somebody creative needs to brainstorm on how we can change the wording, because I looked at it and I just don't.
So
I don't know how we can word it differently to make it clear that we expect exceptions to happen and that most exceptions end up being granted. That's the one thing I think of adding, is that we do end up saying yes to the vast majority. In the case of this particular election, 100% of the exception requests.
Maybe we can just add a few examples.
Yeah, add that as a note.
So thank you, Jordan, for taking notes.
Or maybe something, or everything that is under the purview of the steering committee. So for example, that would be Kubernetes, Kubernetes 6, and everything, or Kubernetes client and other GitHub bugs and everything under that. But something end user would not fall into this because steering committee does not have any governance power on it.
Let's see.
Yeah, I'm able to edit it.
Were there any other, Josh, quick thing, if you reload the page, you should be able to edit it.
Okay.
Were there any other comments on clarifying the exception criteria?
I mean, kind of by nature, the exception process is like things that we can't do in an automated way or have great. I think your comment of like giving examples, like these are things we don't have a great way to measure, like deterministically, but which we've granted exceptions for. So if you fall into these buckets, like please request an exception.
Probably our best example is honestly the majority of the Slack admins wound up filing exception reports if they weren't like active in GitHub, just because all their moderation activities are in Slack and those aren't necessarily reflected, and the nature of them is private actions. Another example would be everything involving like the Code of Conduct Committee, where it's all sort of private actions that aren't necessarily exposed through GitHub.
Was one edge case that I think bears mentioning a little bit. People who are satellites to the community, so people who are doing podcasts or things that don't have anything to do with actual contribution to the community, but are quote unquote promoting Kubernetes. That kind of gives me a little bit of heartburn.
So maybe some examples of things that would be applicable and ones that aren't.
Yeah, I think the anti-case is important. Like, if somebody's doing things for commercial interest, let's say I have a company that does things that are promoting Kubernetes for some reason, and I'm just out being cheerleader for Kubernetes, that doesn't actually help the community.
We were pretty explicit about that in the past, like no meetups, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, we had if you recall, there was a specific case that we had to grapple with that was edgy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, this is the problem that it depends, right? I would say if somebody's running a Kubernetes meetup and it really is independently Kubernetes and not Kubernetes for my company, then, if I'm on the EC when that person submits, I think that counts. It's a question, because like when we evaluated the one case of somebody having a blog, it was how much of this blog is their employer's commercial interest versus how much of it is, core Kubernetes, and that was how we made the judgment. And I think if we're going to provide examples, that would be a good. We'd have the anti-example in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would say that probably. We can restrict by default, not restrict, but you're not eligible by default if you're doing any similar things. But like case by case, we can discuss and review the similar ones.
I mean, I would say we don't want to put, except maybe for that one example, we don't want to put anything discouraging in there, because the simple fact that this year we granted 100% of exceptions suggests to me that not enough people asked for exceptions, right? We should have had a couple that we turned down.
Yeah.
And the fact that we didn't turn anyone down kind of suggests that there were probably people out there who could have been eligible who didn't ask.
Just as a point of clarification or a question is that, did we ever consider doing a registration model?
Yeah, you have that in there as an item later on.
Oh, okay.
I don't understand. Yeah, you did suggest that. I don't understand the benefit of it in, can you explain why that would be beneficial?
Because you'd have people who are actually interested in exercising their duty, as opposed to just getting a bunch of scattershot things to people who may not even care or even know what they're doing. Also, the folks that are sort of peripherally involved could also be lobbied against. So, a company that decided it wanted to flex its muscles about trying to get somebody elected could easily leverage that mechanism as a way to do it.
Wait, they could leverage the registration mechanism?
Meaning, like, if let's say 5 Googlers are registered and all of a sudden 100 Red Hat people registered, that's a clear marker that something happened at Red Hat that has triggered them to influence the vote in a way that's disproportionate to other companies. Like, you would see those sorts of data points come up. Like, roughly speaking, you would probably have the contributor map as far as percentage would be close to what the percentage of contributions would be. So if you had a company that was like spiky disproportionate, then they have obviously got some sort of get out the vote campaign that might be trying to influence the election. So, I mean, not necessarily a true data point, but just would be interesting, I think.
Yeah, but what can we do if we'll see this peak? So we can't restrict, like, if all these people are eligible to vote, it's just like, like some extra information. I have another reason just to second Jay's suggestions on having the registration. I agree with Jay. It's like yet another step that an individual has to perform to actually vote. So if this specific person is actually interested in voting, they'll do something extra, like spend 5 minutes of their life to register there before actually voting in a few weeks. So it's like you are showing your explicit interest in all these procedures and your desire to change the community in some way.
But
Bob, you're going to say something.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So
go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's kind of hard for me to see the pauses and everything in chat just because of the web client. The one thing, like, I'm fairly like against registration because it's too easy to socialize on like Twitter or whatever without some other sort of bounding thing. Like, the GitHub contributions is one thing, or some other exemption form for showing that you are actually active in the community.
Well, I'm not advocating that we wouldn't do that. We would still do that, but instead of just sending everybody trying to come up with some magic list that we know is incorrect, like the best way to get an accurate list is for people who are eligible to submit to vote, and the ones who submit to ask to vote who aren't eligible, then we send them back and say, can you please submit an exception form? Like, that's just a very good way to get high quality signal on who's actually interested in participating.
And yet another benefit of the mandatory registration is that we'll have the actual list of emails, of the email addresses.
Well, except the plan is that next year we won't need the email addresses.
Hopefully.
The project is going well. I see no reason why we wouldn't be ready for next year's election.
It's good to know.
The only thing I guess that could derail us is if GitHub made incompatible API changes between now and the election. So I'm actually opposed to the idea of registration because from my perspective, our goal is maximal community participation. And every step we add to the election process cuts down on the number of people who actually vote.
Yeah. We do have enough problems getting people to vote in the first place.
And you can do this. It's anonymized, but if you think that someone's is trying to stack the election, you can look at the anonymized results and see individuals who voted like -9 or whatever for everyone except for their candidate, right?
Right. Well,
in past, I haven't done it this time. In past elections, I've looked and wondered, there hasn't.
That was how I actually determined that Ian's Twitter campaign got a number of voters, because if you look in the history of this election, you'll notice that there is at least a dozen people who voted for like Ian and one other candidate and put no opinion on everyone else.
Like I said, I didn't look this year.
But I mean, I would say, like, I haven't done any data mining on this, but I would be willing to bet, based on personal experience, that the biggest predictor about whether or not the employees of a certain company vote is whether or not that company has someone who's up for election.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We obviously can't solve that, and we have to trust that the community does the right thing. The registration thing, I think we can table it. I mean, if everybody was yay registration, I think we could continue elaborating, but there's enough contention in this amongst us that it's probably not worth pursuing. It's just something I would put on the table maybe for the future, just to think about. Let's observe future elections.
Yeah. Do we have any more comments on this, or should we move on to the next thing? I just want to be cognizant of time, especially as we lost a little bit in the beginning.
Yeah. Which item are we on? Is this the maximum representation?
Refine rules of exceeding maximum representation.
I read through that issue. It sounded like there was a question about whether it was even a rules change or just a clarification of like the mechanics of the rule we already have.
Yeah, people seem to think it was a rules change, or at least sufficiently different that we couldn't do it for this election. It ended up not mattering for this election, but I can imagine it mattering in the future. And it was just basically a small thing, which is that if you already have a candidate on steering who works for one employer, and you have, say 2 candidates who also work for the same employer, that because the way that it currently works is only the people who are being newly elected could potentially decide who drops out. And I can imagine a circumstance in which the person who's already been on steering for a year might be, I'm actually kind of done with this. And it seems more friendly to offer that as an opportunity. But I think that needs a vote of the full EC to change it.
I'm a little concerned on that, because I don't think like someone stepping down or not should be dependent on their company's representation in the steering committee. It should, it's community over company at the end of the day. But I see where you're coming from. But personally, I feel like someone should not step down just because someone from their company gets a chance to be on the committee.
Right. What I was saying is they should have the opportunity to make that decision, if you follow me.
When this happened last year, the people involved had a separate conversation and figured out what they were going to do, so that if that did come up, it wouldn't be like a steering thing or a community. They just sorted it out themselves. What happens if this, and they kind of came to their own conclusions and then came back to us and said, if these certain people get elected, we will sort it.
As it's written, as it's written now, the EC decides, and the people who work for the same employer are not involved. And my suggestion was that the people who work for the same employer be allowed a chance to decide among themselves, and the EC only decides if they can't.
Yeah, that's why we added the change that we apply affiliation after the election, Because last year there was confusion where I was like, you can't run. There's already 2 people from that employer there. But then we changed it to allow that person to run and then said, you all sort it out depending on the results and then get back to us, which is probably better, I would assume.
I guess the main question is, depending on who steps down, like which election pool is the replacement candidate pulled from, right? Like if there are 2 seats open and someone gets elected and that requires someone to step down, like if it's the existing member, does the replacement for that member get pulled from the election where they were brought in, or does it get pulled from the next lowest candidate?
No. It from the current election. So like say, imagine that I had run for steering here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And we've got both Derek and Christoph, on the board.
Yep.
That is, and I came up as one of the 3 preferred candidates.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that if we change this rule, Derek and Christoph and I would have a meeting, and we would decide which one of us was not going to be on steering. And the EC would only make the decision if the 3 of us did not have a consensus.
I don't think the EC should ever make a decision. That should be steering.
Amen.
Yeah.
I've just put a link to our chat. How does CNCF handle this in our elections? So we have this situation explicitly described in the CNCF charter. Wow. So basically, the procedure is the same as Josh mentioned. So if we have 2 people who, like 2 people for the single place, and one of them has to step down because of the overrepresentation by some company, they have to agree them that together, like have a meeting or whatever, or the random slots shall be drawn. So you can see this in section 6, paragraph B, number 4. Again, it's the symbol how CNCF handles this situation. So it's definitely not dictating how Kubernetes community should do it. Just for your information.
Okay, I agree. This definitely needs clarification. At least it would probably be helpful to describe the various scenarios and who decides at what point and what's the result.
And by the way, when I say the EC decides, the EC decides based entirely on mechanics.
Yeah.
That is, whoever is the least preferred candidate in the current election is the one who doesn't end up on steering. It's not like the EC is making a judgment call. The only way the EC would be making a judgment call is if there was a tie between the preferred candidates for the same employer. And I think that's improbable enough that that the EC could make a judgment call there.
Ihor, do you mind posting that in the main thread on this issue?
I put the link in
the notes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think the main idea is just to follow up on this item and try and clarify the language. And thank you, Jordan.
Okay, the next several items are mine. The next several highlighted items, anyway.
Okay.
So one of the problems we ran in here is, there's a 9-month gap between the existence of election committees. It's not reasonable to assume that the new EC will follow up on retro items from the previous EC. That really, really needs to be the responsibility of steering. And clearly we, once again, have a problem with that because steering is not, as a whole, paying attention to the retro from the election. Because the whole reason why we didn't change over to a GitHub LGTM model for candidates, which would have been better, was because of the lack of follow-up. And we just really need to get into a cadence where the EC delivers their retro stuff, they do whatever changes that they can immediately do, and then it's in the hands of the new steering committee follow up on other changes that need to happen. And that hasn't happened in the past. And I think it's going to be an ongoing problem.
So we would basically need to assign somebody on steering to do the follow-ups then.
I still think it should be EC. I still think that's a very easy thing for y'all to do as part of your checklist. Right now, we PR in a number one item on your checklist where it says check in with steering on dates, on key dates. Right there, you could also say check in with steering on key dates and retro.
I also think this is very steering selective. So last year, Aaron was very, very interested in elections because that's just how that steering committee was. But this steering committee I'm not saying this is good or bad, tends to be more hands-off on the election this year than it was the previous year.
I mean, I was pretty hands-on with you and Bob this year.
Well, the question I have,
wasn't an EC, so I don't know.
The question I had was, is there things that take a really long time, which the steering has to follow up on? If not, then whatever Paris was saying would be enough. If it was like, okay, we need to do the GitHub app for elections, even that is not steering, right? So that is the demarcation that I would like to have. Like if there is things that will take a really long time that somebody needs to keep pushing, then maybe we can assign open an issue and assign it to some steering member to follow up periodically.
Yeah, I would say an example of a long-term item like that would be, in fact, the changes to how maximal representation is handled, right? That is, from my perspective, a decision that the current steering needs to make. And, well, I'm likely to follow up on it. I think ultimately it needs to be the responsibility of the steering committee to make a decision about whether to change those rules or not before the next election.
Agreed. So that is definitely one item that I'll push for sure.
Yeah.
So you can tag my name on that one.
Okay. Yep.
I have added you to the AI for the maximal representation clarification. Yeah, I think it would be super helpful to point to the documentation that the current EC followed and say,
yeah,
like,
I think
anything we want the next EC to do, we need to update that documentation like now with the AI.
Yeah, I linked that above because the problem is that otherwise you end up in the situation where we went like this one, where we went in and there was that retro item about changing the nomination process, but the documentation hadn't been changed. So the natural assumption of a brand new EC is the change was discussed and rejected.
Yep.
Whereas in fact what happened was it was not followed up on.
Yep.
But there was no way for us to know that. So also, I mean, the other thing is that I would say having somebody designated, somebody who's currently at this retro, who is on steering, who is maybe going to brief next year's EC.
Yeah, I thought that
none of the three of us are on it again.
I thought that the next EC gets briefed by this last EC. That's what, like, I thought that was the whole point of like shadowing, and like that's kind of where I thought was happening this year, where it's just like, oh, the last committee just orientates the new one, and then the next committee orientates the new one. That's kind of what I thought was happening, because like from a steering perspective, I just don't think we should be involved in elections at all, with the exception of like the policy part.
So there was like, while there was no initial meeting, we did all sit in a we had a Slack DM group going for quite a while, and Ihor was on the previous election committee. I had to recluse myself as soon as I put my name in the hat for some of it. but we did try, like, again, while there wasn't a meeting, we did try at least keep communication open about it.
I think we should set up a program with Contrib-X, and the program is election officer program. And that program will have an onboarding structure, and Contrib-X is responsible for onboarding those people, for finding those people, for making sure that everybody's cool. I really think that this should be a Contrib-X program and project.
Okay.
Yep.
Somebody, there needs to be a fallback, because what happened this year, right, was we had 2 people who were experienced election people. One of those people decided to run for steering, at which point they had to get out of the process. And the second person was CNCF staff, and the election was starting around the time of KubeCon August. And so that person, that's in the things that did not go well, that person was not very available. So as long as it's a larger pool of people than the 3 EC members, to provide continuity, then that works, regardless of where that pool comes from.
So Contrib-X did ask for like other volunteers, and unfortunately, no one else was interested in it as well.
I heard from some folks after the fact that they didn't hear any announcements.
Okay. There was nothing. It did not go to KDev or the Contrib-X mailing list. It did come up frequently in the meetings, though.
Yeah. So we need to do. I think we need to do mailing list asks next time. I mean, because I feel like we're all so heavy in our meetings right now that we're neglecting the mailing list anyway.
Yeah.
So I really feel like we need to do larger asks on the mailing list, because whenever we do larger asks on the mailing list, we seem to get what we need.
Just to time it, we've got 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
Could we add an AI to clarify the handoff? And it sounds like Paris, you, and maybe Josh had ideas about like Contrib-X or like how that could work. Maybe hammer that out.
Done.
Cool.
Yep. Okay, so the next 2 items are ones that I put in there. They're basically just sort of bus factor items. I don't have a solution for these, but I want to raise them as a problem, which is there's 2 critical steps in the election process that, for technical reasons, are limited to a single person. One is determining the eligibility list, which has become in exercise in data management skills. And thus one person pretty much has to do them. It limits who we can recruit for the EC, because we need to have somebody who's, good with databases or Python or something in order to do that. And the second thing is that person is going to be doing work that is not clearly visible to the other members of the EC. So if somebody raised an issue about that person's impartiality, we wouldn't have an answer for it. Same thing with the, we use SurveyMonkey in order to be open to Chinese contributors for things like the exceptions form. But because of the limited number of logins we're allowed to have with our SurveyMonkey account, that once again means one and only one EC member who's actually collecting that data. I don't have a good, like I said, I don't have a good solution for these things. I just want to flag them as potential future issues, because even with new election software, neither of these particular problems are going to go away.
So at least on the data management side, like the main problem was that the original data dump wasn't, clean. And we had to take care of it multiple times. That was not a problem last year. I think the main follow-up there is to make sure that, we have a good, like before we get the dump from the CNCF, to make sure we have sort of, they're good on their side and the data is accurate. Like at least before we, post the official thing to the list, or cut the PR with the eligible voters. For the most part, like especially once we get to the GitHub way, it should pretty much just be a list of GitHub handles. And the other issues in the past were mostly around like, finding the various emails and things like that. And that should all hopefully be going away.
Well, but there's the issue that even if we get a clean list from the CNCF, right? We still now, under the new rules, need to match it against org members, right? So somebody needs to do that on their computer using either code or a database. And that is something that's going to be done by one member of the EC. That the input and the output may be visible to other methods of the EC, but what happened in between will not be. And like I said, there's two issues there. Issue number one is, if I had gotten COVID during this process, we would have been scrambling to find another EC member who could actually take over that data manipulation. And that this now becomes a criteria for recruiting the EC. There has to be one person who's good with doing messing around with the data. The second, thing is, if say a Red Hatter had been running for election and somebody had accused me of manipulating the eligibility list, I couldn't prove that I hadn't manipulated it. If you follow me. So those are our sort of issues of SPOF with that.
Is there a chance that we can get the data dump from CNCF to include org membership?
Yes. The other thing that could be done there is, right now it's mostly, I think it was a PM, but it could also just be a issue on the CNCF, like in the DevStats repo. So while it doesn't necessarily handle all the, vendor stuff, if they respond back on the issue with the data dump that they provide, then you at least have another public source of, validating essentially the data set.
Okay. So my suggestions are moving more to the CNCF side, if possible, like getting some of that data present, and then finding a way that the interactions where the data is provided and received are made public, so that if shenanigans happen, like you can see this is what CNCF provided, and that username is not in the final list, but they are an org member.
Yep. And then like I can. Sorry, Jorge, go for it.
Yeah, just to comment on the CNCF side, probably it would be great if we'll have a joint discussion with Lucas, who is maintaining the dev stats, to define like the general ability, what can we do with the data, and what kind of data can we retrieve, and what kind of data is not possible to get, and so on. So it would be great to have Lucas involved into the similar conversations, because he's the person who is maintaining the dev stats, maintaining and developing dev stats.
As far as checking the membership and getting the current like org list, that is something that we can follow up with documentation. I can do that. Like I have a little script. It's like a JQ thing that will pull all the members out and give you a dedupe list. So that just probably needs to be documented someplace. And then it's like, a Google Sheet with just a check if in table. Are there any more comments on this? We have 8 minutes left. Josh, is there anything?
Go on to the next thing. Let's go on to the next thing.
Okay, yeah. Is there a high priority item that you want to make sure gets covered right now?
There's a bunch of stuff to do different. What?
There was like 3 or 4 biomechanics and like word limits and stuff were mentioned like 3 or 4 times.
Yeah, and I have a suggestion on one of those items that I've actually implemented for the Knative elections, which is that the candidates update their bios, but the EC prepares the list of candidates on the README. The candidates don't do that. And that eliminates the merge conflicts.
So that's actually how it was done last year. it was just a someone's suggestion to add it in there that originally caused the all the merge conflicts.
Okay, so let's just revert that.
So we could add a note saying "Do not edit."
Yeah.
I am suggesting, so if we go into the ideas for 2021, I have some suggestions to changes in process, which steering would need to approve. So there's several things that are in the timing of the election that seemed odd and suboptimal. One of them was this full week between the close of voting and making the announcement, during which the EC has to keep the results secret. Unless we're doing the thing where we have the two-stage approach to dealing with maximal representation. If we're doing that, we will actually need that week. If we're not doing that, it seems like we could have just a 2-day period or just a weekend where results are secret. That gap of time seems unnecessary, and in the meantime, it's like, you know, asking a bunch of people to keep a secret.
It hasn't leaked, right, Josh, so far?
No.
Okay.
It was like, my question was, what was this week for? What were we
there was no delay last year. I don't remember.
The schedule was timed for it to go like Thursday. The next day was our monthly, well, at that time, weekly.
Yeah.
You know, community meeting.
One of the ones is a big one. Jace, you had a thing here about disqualifying criteria.
Yeah, so I think it was more just like, we should be clear that if like somebody just totally blows the character count for their bio and it sits there, then they essentially have an unfair advantage. Like we can't, I mean, people make mistakes obviously, but if there are cases where somebody just totally flouts one of the rules and it leads to an advantage, then that should be a disqualifying event, like in whatever capacity.
Can you I saw the word count thing mentioned a few times. Did people's bios get merged over the word count?
Yeah, I don't understand how those got merged.
I saw them opened, and I saw Tim asked several people to cut them down before they merged. I didn't actually see any.
No, there was merged bios.
Yeah, probably 1 or 2. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mean that seems like a process thing where they don't get merged if they're over the limit.
Yeah,
right?
but
in the past we would just tell
something
them
over the limit and you're disqualified. Like, just people make mistakes, but we shouldn't merge them.
Yeah.
No,
right.
Agreed. But what I'm saying is that's just one example. Like, the thing is, like, just fundamentally, if we're asking people to become civic leaders in our community, if they're not even remotely following the rules, then that's bad. That's not a great sign. Like, you know what I mean? Like the job of a steering committee member is to respect the rules of the community. Like, so if it's just like blatant, like I didn't even read the thing, I'm just like, hey, I'm cool, I'm running for steering committee. Like that's not, you need to at least pay some marginal attention to the rules, I think. Like, so I don't know. I mean, I'm just take it for what it is. That's my 2 cents. I'll leave it there.
There was a template from last year. Sorry, this is Paris asking about a template in, there was a bio template, but a lot of it's just like free form text from a couple questions. That still makes it easy for people to like go over the limit.
Are there other rules? Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to ask if there were other rules that you think people don't follow, or that we might need to tighten the screws around, or was it just the bios?
I think it was just the bios.
Yeah, it was just the bios. I don't think there was anything else.
Yeah.
But like that became an issue for one of the candidates. Like that, I'm following the rules, the other person isn't. That's penalizing me. So that was why it was brought up.
Yeah, we had one candidate. Like, we had a few folks who have like exceeded the limit a bit, like 5 or 10 characters extra, but one candidate was basically they submitted their bio like that, like around it exceeded the allowed number of characters like in 2 times or something like that. So it was like a really huge bio, which was definitely against the rules. One suggestion that we can add here is that probably one of the election officers can be responsible for counting the number of characters and putting that explicitly as a command to the PR.
That's exactly what we did last year.
Yeah.
I don't know why we didn't do it this year.
But it wasn't written down?
Yes, probably.
The simplest thing is to have a pre-submit check that does the word count. And
if I can do it, it would be great. It's even easier.
Yeah.
Just it won't allow you to merge it there.
Yeah, we are just about out of time. Is there any other major points in this list that we want to cover?
Okay, there's 2, and one other thing to mention discussion, but I want to cover it at the meeting, which is in the current instructions, the call for exceptions ends when voting starts. There actually isn't any good technical reason for that. The EC would be capable of continuing to take exception requests really up until a couple days before the election closes. Because there's like no reason why we can't grant somebody's exception and send them a ballot 3 days before the end of the election. And if we're attempting maximal participation, then because, as an example, somebody who was on vacation during the whole exception period. My suggestion would be to actually change the process to where the request for exceptions for voting, obviously, if you're going to run as a candidate, you have to request an exception before call for nominations closes. That not actually close until 3 days before the end of the election.
Right. I would say we still publish a date for that, Josh, and not leave it until the last possible second.
Right. But the date would be 3 days before the end of the election
closing.
rather than...
Yeah, because it's open for a week or 10 days or however long it is.
Yeah. The second thing that actually is also a timing thing is, at least according to the procedure as written, the candidates themselves don't find out who won until the public steering committee meeting where they're announced. I think this is problematic because sometimes candidates are very invested in the election, and if those candidates don't win and they don't find out until a public meeting, it could result in unfortunate outbursts. It feels very hard on the candidates. I kind of feel like they should be notified some hours before the meeting so that it's not a surprise to the candidates when the meeting starts.
You're here.
I agree.
Yes.
The steering members who were not up for elections, that was Paris, me, Christoph, and Derek, we did talk about this before the results came out, and we were thinking if it made sense to disclose the results to all the candidates before we announced it in the steering meeting over email or whatever, just to help with the anxiety. And I think everyone was in favor then. We just didn't want to change the rules during the election.
Okay.
I'm fine either way, but the thing was like, if there is a problem with the maximum representation thing, then we would the people concerned would have to know, so they can figure out what to do, I guess.
So maybe sometime to figure out the maximum representation thing, and then we disclose the results.
Only if it happens, right, Nikita? Otherwise,
Yeah.
They don't need to know. Yeah.
I gotta drop you all, but thank you so much. It's really great to be a part of this. So
thank you, officers.
Yep, thank you.
Good to see you, Jace. Bye, officers.
Good to see you too. Bye, everybody.
So we are now 3 minutes over. Do we want to call it there or continue on with the, I don't want to, push it like ask people to continue if they don't want to. My schedule is open for a little bit if people do want to. How's everyone feeling about it?
I have to drop.
Okay.
I tried to flag the AIs as we were going through in notes. So if we want to gather those to the end and then make sure everyone has a person or an issue.
I can do that after the call.
Thanks, Bob.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
We want to run another part of the retro. We're done. No.
No.
I mean, like not today, but probably like in a week or 2 weeks if we have enough content to discuss.
Hey, that reminds me. Oh, sorry. We checked in the results, right?
Yes.
Okay, got you.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing that I actually haven't done is an item that here's on the retro, which is I need to send Paris and Bob all of the Google Docs that were associated with this, as well as some other stuff, for them to check into a non-public area of the Google Drive.
Maybe we can just continue the next public steering meeting if there are anything left.
Yeah. Yeah. We can put any high, like mark any high profile items that require discussion. Jace dropped, but if you don't mind, like Josh, Ihor, and can poke Jason Slack too, just like highlighting anything else that should be discussed publicly, we can table it till then.
Yeah, I put the diversity thing under parking lot.
Okay.
That's a hard problem. Speaking of problems that it's going to take a long time to resolve.
Yeah.
Which is, how do we ensure diversity on the SC without implementing a quota system?
Okay. Well, I think with that, we will just call it done for now. Thank you again for, putting up with some of the delays in getting started and all the calendar issues and various other problems with getting the scheduled. Appreciate it.
Cool. Okay, and yep.
I'll see y'all around.
Bye, y'all. For what it's worth, we found problems and we're gonna fix them.
Yeah. Okay.
See y'all.
Later.
Bye.